Thanks very much. It's really an honor to be here. Anytime I'm doing anything for Barbara and the First Amendment Foundation, I feel like I'm really paying back because the work that they do is so important. And Florida, thank God, is still one of the most transparent states in the country, thanks to people like Barbara. There's other states, like I did a book in Louisiana, and not quite the same. A lot of stuff is just missing. So I do want to say that it's important. This kind of work is really important. It's so vital to the work that I've done. And I'm going to walk you through this story a little bit and some of the historical context. But I'm also going to talk about the research and the records, because I think some of that is just as important as the story itself. How some of the information I got came to be. I'm going to start out by talking about probably the most important thing that you need to understand about how a story like this can happen. And the story I'll walk you through is the story of Jesse Daniels in a little town called Okahumpka. It's really a small town with a big secret. And the only way that I found that this could happen is to really understand what was happening in America after Brown versus Board. It was a very important moment in history because here you have this great landmark civil rights case, desegregation of public schools, decided unanimously by the Supreme Court in 1954. But that unanimous ruling didn't really mean a lot, especially down south. This was a moment where all of a sudden race relations deteriorated strongly. You had the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. You had the birth of these citizens' councils, the white citizens' councils. Thurgood Marshall called them the Uptown Klan. He said these were mostly men made of politicians, doctors, lawyers, upstanding members of their communities. And all of a sudden they were working to fight desegregation. And I think one of the researchers called the white citizens' councils, they had the agenda of the Klan, but the demeanor of a Rotary Club. And that's what I really found in this story. You had these upstanding, wealthy white people who were resisting. And at one point in 1956, all of it kind of came to a head, and it came to a head in Florida. And I just want to sort of walk you through some of that because it's important to understand. This was the reaction that you would see in all of the newspapers and in the media coverage of the reaction to Brown versus Board. Segregation forever. We won't go to school with Negroes. And you can sort of see the protests that were happening, these iconic images of the South. One of the things that was really kind of remarkable when I would look through the transcripts of interviews, not just the photographs, but the interviews with people at the time, they didn't say anything like, we don't want our children to go to school with blacks. It was much more vicious, I think. It said, if they come to our schools, they'll be in our bedrooms next. You saw this kind of fear of miscegenation and the mixing of the races, which was at the heart of it. It was very little talk about education together. It was something deeper. And if you looked in Lake County, in Florida, in the after Brown versus Board, there was an organization popped up, which the name sounds kind of ridiculous if you think about it today. It was called the National Association for the Advancement of White People. And this was a man named Bryant Bowles who went on the road and just gave these fiery, impassioned speeches where thousands of citizens would come out and really discuss the plan to resist. And they were basically threatened, saying, if you start sending your children to these schools with Negroes, we're going to run you out of town. So it wasn't just a moral principle thing. It was more of, there were threats involved throughout the community. And these were the kind of rallies that were popping up across the South. And Willis McCall actually invited Bryant Bowles, the head of the NAAWP, to Lake County, where he spoke on the stairs at the Tavares Courthouse, and gave this impassioned speech about white superiority and how blacks were unfit to attend schools with whites. And one of the things he did, getting back to that point I told you about education, he was basically holding up his 3-year-old daughter and said, our beautiful children will not be safe under this Supreme Court mandate. And that wasn't about education, that was about something deeper. In 1957, you could remember this Little Rock Nine, Elizabeth Eckford. This is the imagery that she was greeted with as she began to step foot in Little Rock Central School. And you can see the vitriol and the fiery passion about this when this was starting to take effect and the first schools were starting to implement desegregation. The National Guard was called in. And in 1957, all of this was beginning to truly culminate. I talk about this little town, Okahumpka, with the big secret. This is a photograph of the depot in Okahumpka, which, if you've ever been to Okahumpka, you might not even know it. It's barely a town, population of 300. But what was remarkable in Florida at the time, in 1956, there was an election for the governorship. And Leroy Collins was allowed to run for re-election because he had replaced a fallen governor. And so he was allowed by Constitution, according to Florida, to run for re-election. And in 1956, something was happening in Florida that was very interesting. All of a sudden, you had all of the space industry, the defense industry was booming in Florida. You had tourism, which was booming. Florida's economy was thriving. Citrus, cattle, tourism, you name it. So when it came time for the 1956 election, Leroy Collins was the only one that wanted to talk about the economy. It was just so favorable. What his opponents in that primary, the Democratic primary, wanted to talk about was one issue and one issue alone: race. And it all came down to two cases. Two cases dominated the 56 election. Both of them were centered in Okahumpka. Okay? The Groveland story, which I write about in Devil in the Grove, Governor Leroy Collins did his own investigation into the sentencing of Walter Irvin, the last Groveland boy. And his own investigator said that this was a badly prosecuted case. And even the prosecutor himself, Jesse Hunter, a racist, by his own admission, a racist prosecutor, felt that the evidence was so weak and that McCall was so out of control that he wrote a letter to Governor Leroy Collins recommending that he commute the death sentence of Walter Irvin. This is the case he prosecuted, and he wrote that letter. Pretty remarkable in the South at the time. So that pardon, that commutation of Walter Irvin's sentence became the #1 issue in the 1956 election. Obviously, a groundswell of whites did not approve of this, of saving an African American from the electric chair. So that became the central issue of the 1956 campaign. The second issue that dominated the campaign was the issue of Virgil Hawkins, an African American man who wanted to integrate the University of Florida College of Law. Virgil Hawkins' case had reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court had mandated that Florida accept Virgil Hawkins, and Florida did something kind of spectacular. They refused to obey the mandate of the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall called this a second undeclared civil war. Virgil Hawkins was from Okahumpka. So now you have two cases in Okahumpka that have reached the U.S. Supreme Court, two civil rights race cases in the 1950s. This is a picture of Virgil Hawkins, Okahumpka native. And here you see the High Court demanding that the University of Florida accept him. And this was the news of the day at the time. The story I'm about to walk you through is another interesting case that takes place in Okahumpka. On December 17th, 1957, Blanche Bosanquet-Knowles, the wife of a wealthy citrus baron in Okahumpka, is abducted, or she's sexually assaulted in her home on that evening while her 3 children are in the house. Her husband is away on business. She reports this to the police. The sheriffs and deputies show up, and she says she has been sexually assaulted by a Negro with bushy hair. And so deputies and sheriffs round up 24 suspects in Okahumpka, and they throw them in jail, and they start interrogating them. And they finally narrow down their one suspect, a young African American by the name of Melvin Hawkins, the nephew of Virgil Hawkins. And Virgil Hawkins is going to be the suspect in this case. Here you can see the family of Joe Knowles and Blanche Bosanquet-Knowles. This photograph was taken 2 weeks before this assault. Here's the very first instance of reporting in the Leesburg Daily Commercial. And you can just see a very small article buried in the paper, Negroes sought for attack on woman. That was the very first reporting of this case. Sheriff Willis McCall has now narrowed down his suspect to Virgil Hawkins' nephew. And he parades him out in front of the press. He says, we have pure proof, we have footprint evidence, we have clothes found at the scene, all of it matching Melvin Hawkins. And there he is, embarrassing the family of Hawkins by parading him out there and making sure the media covers this, and it's an embarrassment. And this may be the thing that derails Virgil Hawkins' efforts to desegregate the University of Florida Law School. But then something really curious begins to happen in this case. Joe Knowles, the husband of the victim, returns home, and he has a meeting with the sheriff, and he has a meeting with the state attorney, and he has a meeting with the judge, and he basically conveys the message that it simply will not do for his wife Blanche to have been sexually assaulted by a black man. What are we going to do about it? And so they get together, and the next thing you know, Virgil Hawkins' nephew is released quietly in the middle of the night. And instead, they arrest a 19-year-old white, mentally disabled teenager by the name of Jesse Daniels. Jesse, no evidence against him at all. He's got pretty much of an airtight alibi. He was at home with his family. But because now that there's been this shift in the strategy, Jesse Daniels is taken into jail, and they begin to start to prosecute him in a way, get the evidence, get a confession out of him. Turns out in the confession, Willis McCall held a gun to his head and forced him to sign a paper he could not even read. He had a 4th grade education. They had no evidence against Jesse Daniels, and believe it or not, the victim in the case, Blanche Bosanquet-Knowles, refused to go along with this. She had claimed already that she had been sexually assaulted by an African American, and she was not willing to perjure herself to go along with this story. So what do the prosecutor and the sheriff do? They take Jesse Daniels, they get a judge's signature, and they railroad him to Chattahoochee, the mental institute where he'd spend the next 14 years of his life. In fact, they even got the former state attorney, A.P. Buey, another alum from the University of Florida College of Law, to act as Jesse's court-appointed attorney. And his first action on behalf of Jesse Daniels was to write a letter to the doctors at Chattahoochee saying, between you and I, my client is guilty. I recommend that you keep him there indefinitely. That was the extent of his defense for his client. One of the things about Jesse Daniels, and he is still alive, and I've interviewed him 7 or 8 times, I think, by now. He had a magnificent stutter. He could not go 2 sentences without a stutter. And this is important in the case. It plays a very important part because after the sexual assault in Oklahoma, the victim, Blanche Knowles, recounts a very detailed conversation with Jesse Daniels. And she says nothing about this stutter. And that plays a very big part in the case. Mabel Norris Reese, the reporter for the Mount Dora Topic, she's been covering Willis McCall for quite a long time. She has sort of an interesting arc in her character because in the Groveland story, if you've read that, you recall, she starts out agreeing with the sheriff. She's on the sheriff's side. She's calling for the execution of the Groveland boys. And after Sheriff Willis McCall, after the Supreme Court overturns that verdict, Sheriff Willis McCall says, oh, there's going to be a retrial? I'll go up and get the Groveland boys. He drives up to Rayford State Prison, picks them up, and then turns down a side clay road and opens fire, killing one of the Groveland boys and wounding another. At that point, Mabel Norris Reese feels that she can no longer support the sheriff. She's now completely done a turnabout, and she becomes committed at that moment on to report on all of the sheriff's civil rights injustices, his violations, all his brutality in the community, and she never lets up on this. For the years that would follow, she's constantly a thorn in Sheriff Willis McCall's side. And when Brown comes along, she writes that we need gradual reintroduction of desegregation. This must be done with support, family members. She's not writing the usual line of resistance to desegregation. And because of her stance in Mount Dora, in these editorials, in these papers, she has a cross burned in her yard. The Klan takes some steak, puts strychnine in it, throws it to her dog, and poisons the dog to death. The Klan also throws bombs at her house, 2 military bombs. They vandalize her office, and ultimately they do the one thing that Mabel can't really fight back against. Sheriff Willis McCall walks around Mount Dora, approaching every single one of those business owners and warning them no longer to advertise with Mabel. They actually set up a rival newspaper set up by white supremacists and take all of Mabel's advertisers for 1 year and drive her out of town. She has no choice but to go to Daytona Beach and become a writer and reporter and columnist for the Daytona Beach News Journal. This is an image of the Mount Dora topic, and you can see the fiery burning cross and the vandalism. Talking about what Barbara was talking about research, you know, I do rely on filing these first the Freedom of Information Act requests, and those are vital to my research. But there's also a moment where you really have to get lucky, and I got lucky 3 times in this case. And I'll just talk about them because I just think they're important to sort of where these documents come from. Not only that, but I think I was up against a conspiracy in Lake County for Mabel's files. I would say that not too many reporters were doing what Mabel was doing, which was writing about this Jesse Daniels case. It really got very small coverage in a lot of the other newspapers, but Mabel wrote hundreds of articles beginning in 1958, right after Jesse was arrested. And curiously enough, I looked through the Mount Dora archives. There's bound editions for every single year that newspaper was published, except in 1958. It's missing the entire year. But they told me they made microfilm, and the microfilm has been sent to the University of Florida Library and also the Mount Dora Library. I checked both places. Only the year 1958 is missing from both of those places. And to me, I find that too much of a coincidence. There were people, powerful people in Lake County who did not want this story out. And I've been warned by deputies and Jesse's own lawyer that nobody will talk about this case because it involves powerful people. And so they said, don't be surprised if things are missing. And sure enough, that entire year of 1958 is missing. Well, I had interviewed, Mabel passed away in 1994. I had interviewed her daughter, Patricia, who lived through a lot of this stuff and was able to help me. But one of the things was I never had any of Mabel's original articles, so everything she knew about this case was missing. And it was a real disappointment. I was a little unsure how I was going to go ahead with this. But I interviewed her several times, and I asked her, did your mom keep any of the files from any of the stories she worked in? And she said, my mother kept nothing. Nothing from the newspaper career. It's just personal stuff. And it was extremely disappointing. Patricia died about a year later, and I called down to the family, the granddaughter, Cindy Chesley, to express my condolences. And Cindy said, oh, that's fine. I hope you can still go forward with your book. And she said, by the way, I was cleaning out Mom's attic, and I found a box of files. And she told me it was from Mabel's newspapers. And so I went down to Florida a couple days later, and there was a department store box from the 1950s. And I looked through it. The only thing in those files was the Jesse Daniels case. All the original onion skin drafts of all those articles that had gone missing were in this box. So suddenly I had access to every story, the original draft that Mabel had written, all her correspondence with the governors over the years, fighting for Jesse Daniels' freedom, all of her correspondence with Pearl Daniels, Jesse's mother, desperate mother who was begging for Mabel to continue to keep her son's story in the news so that there might be some action while he was at Chattahoochee. And so this is a photograph I took that night when Cindy handed over the files. I mean, this was like a kid on Christmas. I mean, you just can't imagine. It's only that one Jesse Daniels case. And later on, I found out she'd written something to the effect of, oh, I covered Martin Luther King, and I covered the Groveland story and the Platte desegregation story, but this was the case that mattered to me most. This she felt was her biggest case, and this she did save. And I just was extremely fortunate to get my hands on it. Another stroke of fortune I had along the way was that when I was doing a talk in Groveland, a deputy came up to me, approached, and he stuck his business card in my face. And he said, you got your story right, but you didn't get the whole story. And he went on to tell me that the story of Jesse Daniels was the one I should write about. And he said, I used to drive him back and forth to Chattahoochee. We framed that kid. And it's haunted him, he said, for decades. And he said, he warned me, no one's going to talk about this in town, and you're going to be up against some resistance. But he told me everything he could about the case and why it bothered him. And Evie did something very spectacular in Lake County. In 1960, he turned in 2 fellow deputies for fabricating evidence against 2 African Americans falsely accused of rape. These men were about to go to the electric chair. They were just days away, and Evie turned them in. And the FBI did an investigation. There was a stay of execution. The FBI determined that all of the evidence was taken not from the crime scene, but one of those deputies' backyards. They matched the soil. And so these Lake County deputies got indicted. But that was the end of Evie Griffin's law enforcement career in Lake County for the time being. He was never going to be able to recover from that by violating a thin blue line. Obviously, the threats that he received were significant. He was never far away from a gun, he told me. He said we had mock graves planted around town with my name on them. And I spent many, many, many days with him, interviewing him. He would introduce me to people, including his former partner, who I won't get into it with him, but he revealed to me after several interviews that he was not only Evie's partner and deputy, he was also in the Ku Klux Klan. And he would tell me things, let's just say he'd start sentences with, Gilbert, the first man I killed, and they would go like that. And he described to me how law enforcement worked with the Klan and how they complemented each other in the work and how the lines were blurred. Evie unfortunately passed away a couple weeks ago, but fortunately I was able to get him an advance copy right before he went, and his sons took turns reading it to him in bed. And I honestly think he held out a little bit just to get to see his name in print in a favorable way. Talking about records, this is another stroke of fortune that I had. Richard Graham, young lawyer for the Legal Aid Society in Daytona Beach. After Willis McCall chased out Mabel Norris Reese to Daytona and chased out basically Jesse Daniels' mother Pearl by having the Klan burn down her house, she left to Daytona as well. And she walked into the office at Mabel's behest of Richard Graham, who was a young lawyer just out of school, and began to tell the story and begged for some kind of legal assistance. And Richard Graham couldn't believe what he was hearing. He said, this sounds like a mother making up some crazy story about framing her son. But the more he listened, the more he began to believe Pearl. And he got in touch with Mabel, and Mabel assured him it was all true. Richard Graham is still alive today. He's a former state legislator and a judge appointed by Jeb Bush. And he would tell me, he goes, all my friends, he goes, I was a Republican, all my friends are, what are you doing hanging around crazy Mabel for? He says, I'm not hanging around crazy Mabel. I'm trying to get an innocent kid out of the funny farm. And he was just determined. And they teamed up together with Pearl and Mabel and Richard Graham, and they decided to take on this Lake County power structure and start fighting. And Richard Graham admitted to me that he was absolutely terrified going into Lake County. And he said, Mabel wasn't. Mabel would just say, just get behind me, follow me. And I just thought, this is a real journalist that I wish I had gotten to know. Mabel was actually given plenty of awards. She got one of these awards. It was a Lovejoy Award for Courage in Journalism. First recipient of that. And, she really stuck to this story. I won't give away too much because there's some twists and turns at the end. But as Jessie was languishing at Chattahoochee, she was put onto another story that was going on not too far from her in St. Augustine, covering the 1963 and 64 civil rights unrest. This is an image that's taken at the Monson Motor Lodge. And you might remember these images where they were trying to do these wade-ins in the pools and in the public beaches. And when there was a wade-in at the Monson Motor Lodge, the owner, James Brock, came around with some muriatic acid and poured it into the pool to break up the wade-in. What you don't see outside the photographs is pickup trucks, Klansmen in pickup trucks, and they were full of alligators. And they said, if the acid doesn't get them out, the alligators will next. And so this was the environment that was happening in Florida at the time the 1964 Civil Rights Act was sort of being debated. Martin Luther King said this is the most violent place he'd ever been, and it was Florida. You could see some of the pictures of the wade-ins. Arm in arm, they'd wade into the beach, and every time, day after day and night after night, the Klan would come rushing out while police were there and just start beating the protesters. And this happened, it was on the news screens every single night. And Mabel was right there interviewing Martin Luther King, talking to the Klansmen and getting these unbelievable stories for the Daytona Beach News Journal. And there you see Martin Luther King, whose house was shot out on several different occasions up in Daytona Beach. Interesting thing about Mabel is that later on, the head of the Klan, Hoss Manessy, up in St. Augustine, he was interviewed about the role of the press and what role the press played in the reporting of the civil rights unrest in 1964. And he basically insinuated in the interview that most of the boys covering the civil rights for the papers were donating to his group. He said, except for that Daytona Beach paper, they were the ones that gave us trouble. And that was Mabel. I won't give you too far, but I will tell you that Mabel gets herself another crack at Willis McCall. And it's a pretty dramatic moment where Willis McCall beats a young black man to death in the cell. And this time, Richard Askew demands that there's prosecution. Jesse, after 14 years, finally is returned home to his mother, Pearl. I won't tell you how that came about. There's a little bit of a spoiler in there, but it's interesting. And there you see him with his guitar and playing a song for his mother, Pearl, who stuck by him all those years. And a photograph of him holding a photograph in Life magazine of his nemesis, Sheriff Willis McCall. This is a picture of Mabel later on into the 70s. She continued to write about this. She stayed on top. She wrote letters to the governor, and she really made the effort to reimburse Jesse in a claims bill. And with Richard Graham, the lawyer, they got together, and Mabel played a really important role in that. And so when the claims bill came along, in the language in the claims bill to compensate Jesse for his incarceration, his false incarceration, and exonerate him from this crime, the language in the claim bill said, were it not for the unfailing efforts of a journalist, Jesse would have languished the rest of his life at Chattahoochee. And so she was called out in the language of the bill. And I'll just remind you that Jesse Daniels is still alive. And this is a photograph taken just a couple years ago where I reunited him with his lawyer, Richard Graham, in a very sweet moment. We got together at a conference when Jesse had not seen his lawyer in almost 50 years. And, you know, Jesse obviously had a mental disability, but he also had a kind of an impressive memory. And so we asked, do you remember Richard Graham, your lawyer? And it was kind of a pause, and he didn't say anything. And you could sort of see Richard Graham's face turn, like, oh, this is sad, he doesn't remember me. And then Jesse leaned in and stuttered, do you still have that sweet little blue sports car? And Richard Graham's face just lit up because, yes, he had that car. That was his car. And so this is the power of information, and just one other story I want to tell quickly along the lines of talking about getting documents. I can't really be too specific in this case, but I think you'll follow me. I was contacted on Facebook several years ago by a gentleman who just told me he was a big fan of Devil in the Grove, and he wanted to talk to me because he did some work in Lake County at the time. And he was very familiar with Willis McCall. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because I'm working on a new book about this kid, Jesse Daniels, and it's really unfortunate because the particular records I'm after are missing. There was one agency that had lost 3 years of files. They were just missing in either a flood or a move, but after waiting 2 years, I did an extensive search, and those files were never going to be found again. And I told him this story and how unfortunate it was. And he said, oh, I made copies of those files. They're in my garage. He said, this is the most fascinating case I ever worked on. And I actually went out to his garage, and sure enough, it was all the Jesse Daniels case involving this. So the legacy of people who recalled this great injustice were moved to this moment where they preserved these files. Mabel held on to those files from Jesse. For what reason? She didn't know where this was going. Maybe it's just sort of speaking to history. Maybe these stories need to be told. Maybe there needs to be greater transparency, and that if it wasn't going to be them, maybe somewhere along the line would come along and find this interesting and just want to write the true story with greater transparency and access to these records. So I am going to sit down, and Lauren Ritchie and I are going to have a conversation. And I guarantee you, Lauren Ritchie, who to me is like the Mabel Norris Reese of today for the Orlando Sentinel. There's nobody I respect more. I've been following her, reading her for years. endless respect for her as a reporter, and I would love to, well, I'm actually terrified halfway of the questions she might ask me. But they'll be very good, and I think we'll probably even open it up to the audience. So, Lauren, would you like to join me? Thank you. We might need some help with this.
Oh, I got it.
You did? You did. Here. We're good. Sorry.
Hello? Maybe not good.
Testing.
Oh, we're good now. All right. Thanks.
Okay.
Go easy on me.
But you have really screwed up. Handed me a microphone. Because now I get to tell you more about Oklahoma, which I drove through yesterday, by the way. It's, but the story I want to tell you is from 1980. And the Orlando Sentinel had just hired me. I was a year out of school. And I came to work in the Lake County Bureau. I was 22. I told you this. And I love the picture because even in the picture, you can see the railroad tracks at the depot in Oklahoma. And I got sent out, in the first 2 or 3 weeks I was here, I got sent out to a county meeting because they were moving the post office. And this is where I learned that people think they really do own their post office. And they have like emotional ties to the post office. So I went to this meeting and people were flipping out because they wanted to build a new post office in Oklahoma. And I remember a woman named, I know I'm not making this up, Bobby Gentry, stood up and said, if you put that post office where you want to put it over there on the other side of the tracks, it'll never be safe for white women and children. And I thought, oh my God, I didn't buy a plane ticket to a lot of here. And sure enough, they moved the post office. And I finally, after that meeting, got to actually see Oklahoma. I hadn't even been there yet. Got to see it and realized that the old post office was maybe 100 feet from the new post office. It was just over those tracks.
Right, the tracks made the difference, right?
Tracks being the difference. So my first question is, in light of all that, is to get you to talk a little bit about Leesburg and Oklahoma and the culture that was in operation at the time. Who had the power? Where were women in that culture?
Right. Well, that's really interesting because in the story, Oklahoma was seen as the more rural. It's 5 miles away from Leesburg. Leesburg is the more sophisticated city in Lake County. And it's where a lot of the powerful citrus people lived. And there's some very beautiful neighborhoods and very beautiful houses. Oklahoma, on the other hand, I think there's not that many houses, but none of them look like Leesburg. I mean, this is like, they have north quarters, which is the black section, and the south quarter is the white section. Economically, there's not much difference between those two.
And they actually have roads named North Quarters and South Quarters.
Right. This is going back to the old slavery times and how these were defined. But there's one nice house, one decent-sized 2-story house with white columns out front, and that's where the Knowles lived. And you know, Blanche's family did not want Blanche living out there in the country near the quarters. That was just seen as something that was just nothing that a woman of her social stature should do. But Joe Knowles had decided that they wanted to live out in a more rural section, and he took his wife out there. And there was quite a bit of speculation that this was not a safe thing to do, I think. And it would remove Blanche from that society world of Leesburg society, country clubs, Rotary clubs, and I think there was a certain isolation, not only social, but all sorts of isolation by being that far away. And it plays a very important role in this story because it brings Blanche into the proximity of a very poor section of Lake County. And when Joe is away on these business trips, it represented a threat to her well-being.
It did.
It did.
And the cities run by, how were things run at the time?
Well, I mean, I think obviously you want to follow the money, and I felt like my experience in Lake County, these powerful citrus men, they were the princes of Lake County. At the time, Lake County had a higher citrus production than the entire state of California combined. That's how much money was coming into Lake County. And the people who were profiting from that had their own plantings, they had their own citrus plants. Minute Maid was there, they were investing in that. They really ran things. I think they were the elites and the masters of the universe in terms of this part of Florida. And so, how were things run? I would say it was a good old boy network. There was these quarterback clubs that popped up. And these were very popular in the South, but they were very popular in Florida. And so you had a lot of the graduates from the University of Florida, a lot of University of Florida College of Law alums, and they all joined these quarterback clubs. And it was really, I think, no greater example of a good old boy network. They were the lawyers, the judges, the politicians. They ran things. And Joe Knowles was the founder of the Leesburg Quarterback Club. And one of his associates was Gordon Oldham, who was the state attorney at the time. They were good buds, and they were involved in this case.
Well, that brings up another good point, because I've been reading these reviews, especially the fellow from the New York Times, who's, big shot reviewer, and it was a good review. But he basically laid this whole case at the feet of Willis McCall. And I knew Willis McCall, and I can tell you that Willis would not have cared about to make this happen to frame a white kid. Willis was a whole lot more interested in framing black kids. But this is such a wonderful, the fact that, it's an easy thing to do to just blame Willis, because Willis was indeed an evil character.
Right.
But this tells you how power was wielded in that county for many years, because this didn't happen just because of Willis. We had three or four other people who made this happen.
Right, and that's the initial thing. When they went to Willis McCall with this conspiracy, like, we need a white suspect for this particular crime, Willis McCall was resistant to it. He's like, I am perfectly happy hanging a black man for this crime. Black men go to the electric chair. You want to frame a white kid? We don't send white kids to the electric chair. That was the way justice was meted out throughout the South. In Florida at the time, you had 37 executions for rape, non-homicidal rape. 36 of those were for African Americans accused and convicted of raping white women. If you were white and you raped a white woman, you're not going to the electric chair. If you were black and you raped a black person, you're not going to the electric chair. This was used to preserve that white supremacy in the flower of Southern womanhood. So when you had these powerful men of Lake County sort of insist that Willis McCall, we need a white suspect, he ultimately backed down because he knew he was answerable to, but it was not his first instinct at all.
And speaking of the flower, Blanche.
Yeah, good name for a flower. That's Blanche Bosanquet.
Well, and her family had a big floral shop in Leesburg for many years, and were part of the business community. It was interesting watching Gilbert research this, because I still live in Lake County. I've been there 38 years, since the Sentinel hired me when I was about 12. And I have been able to watch all this happen. And I could see you were really hoping through this whole thing, Blanche is the hero, because it seemed like she wasn't really going to testify that it was a white kid. She initially said it was a black person who raped her, and she then shut up, thanks to her husband, Joe Knowles. And I know you were so hoping, but it didn't really turn out that she was the hero, did it?
No, and that was one of the things that made me really respect people like Pearl and Mabel, because they stood up to this pressure from the white community to do the right thing and to go, the pressure, in order to keep up this structure of white supremacy, whites were expected to perjure themselves. Whites were expected to go along with this lie whenever possible. They had to follow and toe the line. And there was a great deal of pressure on white people to support this. And it destroyed many of them. It destroyed Evie Griffin, it destroyed Mabel in a lot of ways. But then when it came down to Blanche, she has this moment where she doesn't want to go along with this plot to send Jesse Daniels off because she knows that it's in her heart. It's not true. But then, you know, towards the end of the book, she's leaned on by the powerful people of Lake County, including her husband, the state attorney, the judge. And now these men are facing prison sentences for conspiracy. And there's pressure on Blanche. And it's kind of a telling moment in the book where she has a choice to make. It's kind of heartbreaking, but yes, she doesn't really emerge as a hero.
So who is the hero?
I would have to say the heroes, like all the stories I write about, it's usually the people who stand up to the power and ultimately put their own lives at risk. Whether it's Thurgood Marshall and those young lawyers who were out front of the civil rights movement. You know, before there's protests, all the civil rights gains were done in the courts. So I would look at Thurgood Marshall and his young African-American lawyers who did everything right, went to law school, practiced law according to the Constitution, and find themselves being chased out of town by the Klan. In this particular case, I think you can always look to the person who's standing up to the Klan, and that would be Mabel and Pearl, who never backed down. And even when they had to leave town because their houses were burned down and they were bombed and they were ruined financially, they still continued to fight. Pearl had no resources whatsoever. She had no money, and yet she was a letter writer. She was using her words to fight back, the only thing she had. And she would write letters to J. Edgar Hoover saying, you have to open a civil rights investigation. She wrote dozens of letters to J. Edgar Hoover. Ultimately, Hoover's writing her back. Hoover's giving her legal advice in his own letter handwriting. And he's telling her, you know, once this goes to trial, you'll be given a court-appointed attorney, and then you'll have a chance to go through the system. And she'd write back, no, you don't understand. They're in on it. They're all in on it together. I can't get a court-appointed attorney in Lake County. And finally, she becomes such a nuisance to Hoover that he says, fine, open up a civil rights investigation. He just passes it off to the Department of Justice. But that became the moment where this case began to gain momentum. And it was all because of Pearl's letters.
But yet, you heard about the story from a guy who was a pretty big racist. Eddie Griffin, who later became a sheriff in Lake County and spent a couple of terms really trying to modernize the sheriff's department, which was pretty backward at the time. And he was no civil rights advocate, but this bothered him. How did he maneuver between these two worlds? I mean, he's got his good old boy white world that has dinner and breakfast up in Umatilla every day.
Right.
How do you manage that?
Well, I think this is one of the most interesting parts of these kind of stories. Like, they're not black and white, they're really in those gray margins, and it's complex. So Evie Griffin, I wouldn't say that the reason he turned in those two deputies for falsifying evidence to save the lives of two black men because he was racially enlightened. He had a grudge against Sheriff Lois McCall. And he was actually a little bit angry at me because I was going to write that he showed up at the NAACP offices in order to tell this story and save the lives of these two African Americans. And he did not want that in the book. And it was just a thing that he just did not want to be seen as a white person who was helping out the NAACP. So he said, I asked him, well, what did you think about why you turned them in? He said, well, it was the wrong thing to do to frame these guys for a rape that they didn't commit. But I don't want it out there that I went to the NAACP offices to help. And so he was really fighting this very complex battle within himself. And ultimately, I had to write it. I don't know if he got to that point in the book before he passed away, because his son said he was smiling. I do not think he would have smiled like that.
Oh, I think Evie would have smiled as long as his name was in it.
Spelled correctly.
You know, most of the people in the story are dead at this point, but their children are alive. And their children are in their 50s and 60s now, most of them. And I'm just wondering how this book is going over with them how they've reacted. I know I've had some reaction.
No, that's a little more than I have. I'm not sure how it's going on. I don't think it's going on very favorably. I also sort of understand. They helped me, and I interviewed them several times, and it was painful. You know, I sat down with all 3 children and their spouses and other family members, and I think it was like 11 hours I spent with them one straight time.
Noel's children.
Right, Noel's children. And at one point, I remember one of the sons said, "All right, Gilbert, tell us about the night our mother was attacked." And they wanted to know what I knew. And it was I think it was the hardest conversation I ever had to have, because I knew things and I had to discuss this with them. And, you know, ultimately, there was a conversation after the sexual assault that forms a big part of this book. And after the sexual assault, her attacker is leaving the room, and he turns to Blanche and he says, "By the way, a man paid me $5,000 to kill you tonight. Don't you want to know who that man is?" Without a stutter, he says this. And Blanche says, "Well, yes, if it will move you out of my house faster, please tell me." And he says, "Oh, you're going to be sly? If you're going to be sly, I'm not going to tell you." And he left her with that for years. And you know, this is a moment in this transcript had disappeared for decades. Blanche's statement about what had happened to her after that night. And it forms a big part of the book because later on, there's a young African American who's about to go to the electric chair for another sexual assault in that town that looks an awful lot like the attack on Blanche. And when Jesse's mother and Mabel show up at that prison on the hunch that maybe these 2 cases are connected, he says to Mabel and Blanche, or he says to Pearl, "Jesse Daniels didn't rape Blanche supposed Kent Knowles." And he goes on to recount a conversation that only Blanche knew about. And so it's this really dark moment. And I had to explain that to the families about what was happening in that room. And it was, I mean, all of them were just crying in the middle of this kitchen. And I couldn't even imagine what this would have been like to listen to. So it was one of the most difficult parts of the whole case.
I think it did hit home, especially the one son is a banker in Lake County, and he's a very prominent person in the county. And he walks with a guy that I know very well. They both grew up together in Leesburg. They walk every morning, and I called my buddy and said, "Hey, Billy Bob, what's Steve have to say about the book?" And he says, "Well, I don't know." I said, "Well," he says, "I don't think it's out yet." So he's had a copy for 3 weeks. Never mentioned it to his best friend. Walking in the mornings. I mean, that's how. But if you have not read the book yet, I think you'll find that it is a very intimate look at a family, and not just because of the description of the rape.
Right.
And I think that's what's got them kind of worked up. But the whole culture of Leesburg for many years has been that, you know, the ladies are Southern belles, and they don't talk about this sort of thing, and they're never involved in anything like that. So they just simply are quiet about it, and it's never discussed. So it's not a surprise that these 3 children would know absolutely nothing about what happened to their mother.
Right. And I find that people would talk about this and gossip about it. They knew about the story, but I find like when I interviewed people, they did not have any idea of what really happened. So when I went into the North Quarters in Oklahoma and spoke with members of the Virgil Hawkins family. So this is a family who's, you know, this woman's brother was accused of this crime. And they knew he had nothing to do with it. They didn't understand how this conspiracy went. They knew nothing of the conspiracy. In fact, Melvin's sister said to me, "Well, what really happened, you see, is that Jesse Daniels painted his face black, and Blanche scratched his face, and that's how they knew it was really a white boy underneath that." They had no idea of the real, and the real story was even more depraved and more bizarre, is that they framed an innocent person to have an official story of who the actual attacker was. And that got to me constantly. I would hear people tell me that they know exactly what happened, and they would describe the rumors that they'd heard over the years. which made no sense and had no basis in fact.
There's two things I want to bring out about Blanche, and then I think we should open it
Sure.
to questions. First of all, I can see you don't want to tell the story of where Joe was the night that Blanche was raped. But I'm gonna make you tell us.
No, I'm happy to. I haven't gotten to it because this story is complex. There's a lot of different elements that come together in the end. So one of the things that's kind of interesting in the story is that on the night that Blanche Knowles was sexually assaulted in her home, Joe Knowles was not on business, as he told his wife. He was actually having an affair with a young congressional aide that he'd met in Washington, D.C. And I had heard rumors that, oh, Joe was having an affair, but as a writer, I'd been working on this for a couple of years. I didn't think I was ever going to get the name of who this person was or confirmation of these rumors, but I did know that the rumors existed. And so when I filed the Freedom of Information Act request, I finally got the call that the files were available to me at the National Archives in Maryland. And they gave me all the files. I sat down at the desk, and I'm looking through the FBI files, and I see that the FBI has interviewed a woman, the girlfriend of Joe Knowles, who Joe was with that night in Tampa when his wife was back in Oklahoma and raped. And the name of the woman was Mary Ellen Hawkins. Mary Ellen Hawkins, young congressional aide at the time, goes on to become a Florida state legislator for 20 years. She becomes the grand dame of Collier County politics. And she was with him on this night, and there were rumors going around that she was the one who had hired the actual attacker to do away with Blanche so that she could go off with Joe Knowles. And the FBI investigated this. They went through all the banking records, they interrogated her, and never able to find any evidence linking the two. However, later on, when this claims bill comes before the legislature, it occurs in Mary Ellen Hawkins' first year in the legislature. She has a vote on this, and she votes to award the maximum amount to Jesse Daniels. So I thought that was pretty interesting, that she was further touched by the story.
It is interesting, because I'll tell you what, I would step off and Joe Knowles. He was a nasty human being.
She really stuck by him in a strange way. She said, you know, her last words to me was, "Be kind to Joe. He was a good old boy." So she stuck by him in a way.
The other interesting thing about Blanche is the question of how much guilt she felt over the years. And I think if you just tell people what she did for a living,
right,
it answers the question of how she worked through that guilt.
Right, and so afterwards, once Jessie was finally released and exonerated, she was a teacher at the Leesburg High School, and she went and got her master's degree in special education and spent the rest of her years at Leesburg working with mentally disabled students. And I asked the son, Steve, about that, and he said there was a reason she did that. There's two victims in this story. So they did kind of acknowledge it. I'm sure she was living with a great deal of regret and guilt over the years, and that did influence her decision.
All right, who's got questions? Got a million.
Yes, sir. Yes. You just stand so everyone can hear me.
Sure.
First off, thank you for